I just got back from the most amazing trip to the Middle East, the Holy Land, as some call it, Israel and the occupied territories of Palestine, as others call it. I was expecting to see and experience awe of being where the three Abrahamic traditions trace their lineages and to learn more about the political scenes and struggle. Although I didn't think they would challenge me to my core as much as they did. And there were a lot of things that I learned that I didn't expect. The extreme generosity of the people is one. I was given this gift by Christian Palestinians in Bethlehem. It is all handmade. I encourage you to come up and look at it as the cross of Jerusalem on it. I didn't expect just how good feta cheese really was over there. And how much better hummus is and how many different ways it can taste. I didn't expect how unholy some of the holy sites felt and how I might find overlaps between their elections and ours here in the US. So you see, the day that we arrived in Israel, they were having their 5th election in 4 years. They work by coalition, and I think it's fair to say that their coalitions weren't getting along, so it was time for another election. Even though it was the 5th in 4 years, 71% of their electorate showed up, and the result was a sharp right turn to the conservative far right and Netanyahu regaining power. The Washington Post called the far-right group that enabled this term a, quote, once fringe, aggressively anti-democratic, fundamentally racist movement that may soon control some of the country's most influential positions of power. The party, which is known as religious Zionism, has a leader who is a self-described proud homophobe, who has announced plans to hobble Israel's justice system. That party now has 15 seats in Israel's parliament, making it the 3rd largest party. Does any of this sound familiar with what's happening here and around the world? So that set the scene, because a few days later was the US elections, and we very easily could have come to the similar place. This country had people running who were election deniers, shredding our democratic process, focusing on crime, which we all know is code for increasing the policing of Black bodies, wanting to take away autonomy for our bodies, especially for those who can give birth and our trans siblings. I want to be clear on this. Some of these folks were still elected. But the broad sweep to make that the standard luckily did not happen. The American people, by a thin margin, but still, put a check on the extreme right taking over our system of government. Religious nationalism has always been around, and many countries are dealing with it. But America has, as we often do, a unique brand of Christian nationalism. And it is something that we as Unitarian Universalists need to be able to define, resist, and explain clearly why it is against our values. The best explanation I could find was from the magazine, a progressive magazine called Christianity Today. I am paraphrasing their words. Let's start by defining patriotism. Patriotism is the love of country. It's different than nationalism, which is an argument about how to define our country. We can love our country, and as part of that, we can work to improve it, hold it up for critique, and work for justice when it errs. So what is nationalism? Most scholars agree that nationalism starts with the belief that humanity is divisible into mutually distinct, internally coherent cultural groups defined by shared traits like language, religion, ethnicity, or culture. From there, the scholars say nationalists believe that these groups should each have their own governments, that governments should promote and protect a nation's cultural identity and that sovereign national groups provide meaning and purpose for human beings. That's nationalism. So then what is Christian nationalism? Well, Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Popularly, Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation. It is a belief that Christianity is central and those who believe in the faith should have a privileged position within it. Christian nationalists want the government to promote a specific cultural template as the official culture of the country. Now, this goes against what we know to be true and beautiful about America. But while we see multiculturalism, religious pluralism, and diversity in identities as awesome and maybe even divinely inspired, Christian nationalists are threatened that their culture is changing. They want to enshrine legislature that locks down the ideals of their culture as American culture. So how did we get here? Well, many scholars believe that it is so prevalent now because the culture has been changing pretty rapidly. That's not new to our times, but it can feel treacherous for some. Those who they consider the liberal elites, yeah, that's me. How about you? Anyone? Liberal elites here? The liberal elites have triggered a defensive reaction and the sense that they are outsiders in their own land, even though we perfectly well know it was never their land to begin with. They are confused about changes in gender identity, sexual orientations, and who can get married. And unfortunately, leaders in the Republican Party have fed, justified, and exploited conservative Christians' defensiveness in service to an aggressive, reactionary politics. This has included deadly mask and vaccine resistance, the discrediting of fair elections, baseless accusations of gay grooming in schools, the silencing of teaching about the United States history of racism, and for some, a patently false belief that godless conspiracies have taken hold of political institutions. But I am not here to justify their actions as being a little confused or worried or disoriented or surprised by how fast things are happening. Evangelical militancy cannot be seen simply as a response to fearful times. For conservative white evangelicals, a militant faith required an ever-present sense of threat. The threat is what's the reason to be militantly faithful. This is a tool by those in power to keep people afraid and glued to their faith and deserving of their privileged position. And the threat they've created are the beliefs that we as Unitarian Universalists hold so dear. Pluralism of faith, freedom to explore your gender, your sexuality, your beliefs, and definition of family, freedom of expression, and bodily autonomy. Those are what the threats are that's being used for powering this movement. It's a power play, and religion is the weapon. So let's be very explicit about what the problem is with nationalism. First of all, it's not based in reality. Humanity is not easily divisible into mutually distinct cultural units. That's not how it works. Cultures overlap, they're fluid, their borders are fuzzy, but political borders are hard and semi-permanent. Attempting to create political legitimacy on cultural likeness means political order will always not be relevant and possibly will be oppressive by the non-dominant groups. Stomping out diversity is not realistic, and cultural pluralism and religious pluralism is present. It's inevitable. It's desirable in every nation. The problem is that when nationalists go about constructing their nation, then they have to figure out who is, and then by default, who is not part of that nation. But there are so many of us that don't fit into that definition. I'd say most people in this room. And then here comes the crux. In the absence of moral authority, nationalists can only establish themselves by force. Nationalist governments tend to become authoritarian and oppressive in practice. We have so many historical examples of this. Protestantism was the quasi-established official religion for many years, which meant that Catholics, Muslims, and Jews were inherently discriminated. Worse, the US as a whole and many individual states used Christianity as a prop to support slavery and segregation. To be explicitly clear, Christian nationalism runs counter to the values and ideals that we hold as Unitarian Universalists. I want to be clear that Christianity doesn't, but Christian nationalism does. The best articulation I've found of this takeover of both Christianity and the conservative right is from a book that I highly recommend. It's called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation by Kristen Cobbs-Dumez. She says, more than any other religious demographic in America, white evangelical Protestants support preemptive war, condone the use of torture, and favor the death penalty. For them, the good news of the Christian gospel has become inextricably linked to a staunch commitment to a patriarchal authority and gender difference. And all of those are intertwined with white racial identity. She calls out evangelicals' embrace of militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. Now, some Christian nationalists have looked to figure out how to do this and enshrine it into our legislature. Some have advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to recognize America's Christian heritage. Others to reinstitute prayer in public schools. Some work to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of American history in school curriculum, including that America has a special relationship with God or has been chosen by him to carry out a special mission on earth. Others advocate for immigration restrictions specifically to prevent a change in that American religious or ethnic demographic or culture. Some want to empower the government to take stronger action to circumscribe what they consider biblically immoral behavior, like being queer or trans, or watching drag shows, or dictating who gets to be married, or how resistance is shown. Don't even get me started on how those aren't even biblical. But again, I digress. And Christian nationalism has shown up in even more extreme ways on the campaign trails in these last several years. Evangelical Christian leaders have been on the campaign trails with candidates. These charismatic leaders promote religious ideas like faith healing, divine signs, and spiritual warfare. They are calling certain candidates prophets and using their religious messages to blur the line between prophecy and the choices of democracy. Whew. Now, I want to be really clear on this. As Unitarian Universalists, sometimes we make the mistake that many Christian nationalists do, but on the other side, of lumping everyone together and saying they are of the same culture. So I want to be very clear that this is a subset of Christianity. It is a subset of denominations that are preaching it from their pulpits, and it does not apply to everyone in that denomination. We have the ability to be nuanced and intelligent enough of not trapping all Christians together. There are plenty of Christians in our world, in our community, and right here in this room who do not agree with those ideals and call themselves Christians. Please don't do that. And indeed, Christianity has been involved in both the good and the bad of this so-called American experiment. Many Christians used their faith to end slavery and segregation and believed and believe that their faith calls them, requires them even, to work for justice. They work to advance Christian principles, though. The principles and their own Christian principles, not Christian power or not Christian culture, which is the key distinction between normal Christian political engagement and Christian nationalism. Normal Christian political engagement is humble, it's loving, it's connected, and it's sacrificial. And I think this is where many of us see the hypocrisy of Christianity, and we look at it with incredulity, right? I know that some of you have said, but how is this Christianity? As if that's logical and therefore it should make sense. Christianity has not taken a straight line from the message of Jesus in the New Testament to now. That's not how religion works. Now we know that Jesus preached against overt religious power. He welcomed social outcasts and those that were considered other. And the kingdom of God that he envisioned was not a kingdom at all, but a community of people where peace and love of our neighbor and helping those who need help and caring for each other, that's what reigned. Jesus rejected the role of a political Messiah. The fact that his name, the religion of his name, is being used in this way has many of us incredulous and shaking our heads. Cultural icon Rainn Wilson says it well. The metamorphosis of Jesus Christ from a humble servant of the abject poor to a symbol that stands for gun rights, prosperity theology, anti-science, limited government that neglects the destitute, and fierce nationalism is truly the strangest transformation in human history. And popular theologian Rachel Held Evans said, the early church would be utterly baffled by the idea that future Christians would shame someone for not swearing allegiance to the empire. So what do we do about this? Well, I've got a few thoughts. First of all, I wanted to be clear on what the definitions were so that we can name it when we see it. I've spent some time describing it so that when we see it happening out of the mouths of our family next week at a holiday, perhaps, that we can name it for what it is. When we see it on the news, when we hear about it, we can go, oh yeah, I know what that is. And then we need to speak out on it. I know some of you are already practicing biting your tongues, right? Aren't you? Through our votes, through our rallies, and yes, I encourage you to even say something in your family discussions. We need to state unequivocally that these people are not speaking for us. And indeed, this is not what Christianity means to us. And these are not our values. We need to say them so that people don't think that this is what everyone thinks. It is not what we represent. Third, I encourage us to support Christians who are aligned with the peaceful Christianity that we know is out there. Lift them up, find them, say, we know, we see the good work that you are doing. It is ironic that this form of Christianity has become an act of resistance, and we know how to support resistors. And yes, for Arizona and some of the country, it feels like we just barely stepped away from the worst case abyss, but barely. These candidates still got millions of votes. And while the far extreme might be curbed a little bit, Christian nationalism is alive and well. Mostly, we need to stay grounded and committed to the ideals of our faith, the tenets that seem empowering, that are empowering for us and seem reasonable, right? And yet are radical in this current world. We must continue to stand for multiple religious faiths practicing freely in this country. We must stand for peace and compassion in our relationships with each other. We must stand up for the marginalized and those working for peace. We are impelled to stand up for those who the Christian nationalists see as outside that culture. That is our job. That is our role, to make sure that we see them and say, yes, you are part of this country as well. We must keep lifting up the marginalized. We must be working for bodily autonomy. We must work for the separation of church and states. My beloveds, I don't think that Christian nationalists are holding up Christian ideals. Ironically, it comes to us to make sure that they do. May our ideals of peace, of compassion, of care, of working for all others, and of love, damn it, for love, may love prevail. It always does. So might it be.